Hi everyone, we're going to get started. I want to say welcome to everyone in the room and also on Zoom. So this is our 5th seminar for the Aphasia Centre of Research Excellence seminar series. I'm Emily Brogan from Western Australia, Edith Cowan University, and I'm facilitating the seminar today. I would like to begin by acknowledging the Indigenous elders past, present and emerging, and pay my respects to the Noongar Whadjuk people, the traditional custodians of this land in which we meet today. This is, was and always will be Aboriginal land. We warmly welcome you and are delighted to have Associate Professor Erin Godecke as one of our Chief Investigators at the Aphasia CRE from Edith Cowan University. Just some housekeeping to begin. Please be patient with us and the technology today. We're gathering many attendees via the Zoom links. So our apologies in advance if there are any disruptions to your viewing during the seminar. Occasionally attendees will join in late via Zoom, so there may be some background noise. To enhance everyone's experience, please mute your microphone, turn off your video and minimize the Zoom gallery. Thank you. Okay, so you can access this recording after today. Videos will be uploaded in 1 to 2 weeks, and that's on the Aphasia CRE website on the resources tab, and all previous seminars are also available there to view. Questions for this seminar will be aided by the use of Slido. You can log in anonymously or with your name, and you'll be able to see all questions put forward by other audience members. It's a great way to engage with the presentation experience and allows you to ask questions online so you can concentrate on the presentation. Our event code is 2509, as you can see on the screen there. Enter your question under the questions tab anytime. If you like a question, click on the thumbs up button. This will show us the most burning questions, and we'll answer those first at the end. We'll answer as many questions as time allows. You can also interact with us via social media, so please engage and feel free to tweet along today and use the Aphasia CRE hashtag. So I'm now going to introduce Associate Professor Erin Godecke from Edith Cowan University in Western Australia. Erin is a Chief Investigator with the Aphasia CRE and leads Program 2, Treatment Effectiveness. Erin was the Clinical Director of the very early Rehabilitation in Speech VERSE trial for aphasia after stroke. This was a large Australian multi-site clinical trial investigating the efficacy and cost effectiveness of very early aphasia therapy in stroke recovery. Erin also contributes significantly to stroke and aphasia care at local, national and international levels. Today, Erin will generously share her research on early aphasia intervention after stroke. Thank you, Erin. Very good to go.
Thanks, Em, and thanks to everybody for coming on board and spending some time. Apologies for the time change. When we advertised our initial meeting time, daylight savings happened in the middle, so hence the change. So apologies if you got caught. Okay, so today I am really proud to present the VERSE work, but just as a, oh, okay, no. Wow, no, sorry. Yeah, we are. Technical hitch. There we go. I'm just going to take you through where VERSE sits within the CRE and the treatment effectiveness and across the continuum of care, that's quite difficult to say, is one of the 4 pillars of the CRE's research program. I'm very proud and very privileged to be able to head up that group, and within the group Verse sits quite fundamentally and underpins some of the work in early effectiveness that I'm going to show you today. And so, as you know, and probably have heard previously, the CRE has a research platform, and the 4 projects are designed within the CRE. So the first project is the neurological and psychological predictors of recovery. Then there's the treatment effectiveness across the continuum. We're then focusing on technology for healthcare and communication in rehabilitation, and then optimizing mental health and aphasia well-being. So we've got a research platform that is looking to help us translate the evidence that's being generated into clinical practice. And this is a real passion of mine. I'm a clinician before I'm a researcher, and I'm really passionate about making sure that we're providing evidence-based practice. The CRE is a perfect vehicle to be able to, over the next 5 years, see if we can really channel the information and the momentum that we've got in research and put that into clinical practice. We're doing that with some health economics, some technology enabled approaches to aphasia research, and particularly the Aphasia Research Hub. So it's really exciting to see how much we're going to progress over the next 5 years for. So in our treatment effectiveness, I know that's blotted out at the moment, but we're looking at acute and subacute communication, enhanced recovery, and intensity and dose in treatment studies. And that's where Verse sits within the whole CRE. And so what I'm going to present on today is looking at the question, does intensive aphasia therapy improve outcomes? And I'm going to show you the results of the very early rehabilitation in speech trial. Just some quick acknowledgements of our investigators for Verse. It was a diverse group of specialists in the field. We know a couple of familiar faces there. Everybody in the Verse group had a particular role in relation to running clinical trials and being able to be enhancing the aphasia aspect of the intervention. So Verse started way back in 1998 when I commenced my PhD. And I did that because one of the physiotherapists that I worked with said to me, you know what, I'll take that patient because aphasia therapy doesn't work anyway. And I harumphed around and I harumphed and went, oh, I haven't got any evidence to tell her that it does. And so off I marched and thought, I'll show you. And then I started a PhD. That PhD was a randomized controlled trial, and it's the basis of the Verse trial as we went across the next 15 years to develop some research and to put together a clinical trial, a large phase 3 clinical trial that we just finished last year. And so what I am going to show you today is the baseline characteristics for the people in my PhD, and it showed that we had people coming into an acute facility getting therapy. They stayed for about 22 days, which is a long time. This was done back in 2003 through to 2009, I think. Much longer than what people are staying in today's length of stay. But what we showed was that, I don't know if my mouse comes up. Does it come up? It does, there we go. What we showed was that we could get people started in intervention inside 3 days of having had a stroke, and that people were coming in with quite severe aphasia as measured on the Western Aphasia Battery, which is a standard outcome measurement to test aphasia severity. And when we provided people with daily therapy versus therapy done as what was standard care in back in those years, we showed that people who got daily therapy in this group here did much better than those people who got what was standard usual care. The difference between the amount of therapy provided in that first 22 days of their stroke onset was around about, I can't remember off the top of my head, ended up being 45 minutes of therapy over 5 days. So the total amount of intervention wasn't huge, but it did show that when people got standard care, which was a mean of about 14 minutes of therapy, i.e. they weren't really getting very much intervention at all, that there was a difference in their communication outcome that was statistically significant. So when we look at the between group comparisons for those groups, we can see, and can I shift that? Or can I just maybe even put it down? There we go. I'm going to do that so we can see the screen. What our some really important information from the PhD was the people in this weekly group, there were 27 people representing these data. Of those 27 people, 24 of them got no therapy whatsoever in those first 3 weeks of their stroke. And what that showed us was they had an amount of improvement that was stipulated to be equivalent to what the brain would get by itself. So that would be spontaneous recovery. We measured that spontaneous recovery because that's all of the therapy that the participants received at therapy end. And then again, we measured it at 6 months. What this showed us was that, and what these data have become when we are going right through to the end of the talk today, and the link between these points is that at the first month post-stroke, there's an amount of recovery that the brain gets all by itself. And at the moment, we can calculate that to being about 0.38 on the Cowan's effect size calculation. And that recovery, when combined with whatever the people got in usual care and across the next 6 months of their aphasia trajectory, moves out to about 0.75. And when we look at effect size, we can see that spontaneous recovery equates to between a small and a medium effect. When we put that out with therapy out to 26 weeks, we can see it's starting to move up to a large effect size. So this is telling us that people with acute aphasia recover with a large effect in that first 6 months of their recovery. And you can see that by the graph in the table. And this is nothing new. We know that people with aphasia recover in that first 6 months. But what we don't know is how much, and how much does therapy help to enhance that recovery. And so this is what we now have started to map out as our spontaneous recovery equivalent. And so the VERSE therapy, prior to the PhD that I had done and another couple of studies in Europe, when we look at aphasia recovery across all aspects of aphasia, so chronic and early recovery, we can see from the review, the highest level of evidence, the systematic review in 2016, that aphasia therapy works. But what we don't have and what we don't know is that that level of evidence does not directly apply to people and recovery in the first month when they're starting therapy within the first month post-stroke. We've based a lot of our information and a lot of our hypothesis around testing recovery and how recovery happens on 2 bodies of literature. The predominant body of literature comes from the neuroscience field, and that literature tells us that predominantly that was done in animal models of motor recovery, so recovering their arm and leg function after a stroke, an induced stroke. But it also comes from human results and human motor recovery. And because we don't have the capacity to be able to measure animal model recovery and communication, there's a large amount of extrapolation that happens. In this neuroscience literature, what we know is that research tells us that there's a window of opportunity where there's enhanced proteins and neurons, proteins and chemicals in the brain that produce that spontaneous recovery effect. And our premise in VERSE was that we believed that window of opportunity would do better and we would get better outcomes if that spontaneous recovery was given extra intensive therapy. So when we think about what that means, it means that if we were to drive that spontaneous recovery with extra therapy, we would get better cell growth within the brain, and that the brain extra connections and the relearning of new behaviours would be enhanced. And this is just a quick diagram to show you that with what we aim to do in rehabilitation is to improve and grow neurons into pathways that mean that there's an effective behaviour learned from the therapeutic input. And this means that what we're trying to do is make sure that by doing a lot of practice over tasks, that those connections are improved and enhanced. And this is another diagram just to show you how that diagram from the cell level is in the next level where two cells are joining each other. And then when we think about how that's got to work in a communication sense, we see that there are highlights around the brain that represent that new neuronal growth in brains and recovery. And the VERSE trial was looking to see if we could enhance that behavioural outcome from the therapy that we were doing and making sure that it was an intense intervention. So to have a must-haves in a clinical trial, for us to be able to prove this, there are certain bars that we need to jump over to make sure that our trial is robust and make sure that we can deliver the evidence and tell you the true story. So we must make sure in a clinical trial that at the beginning of the trial or at the baseline, that the participants in each of the groups are all equal. So they're all equal in their stroke severity, their aphasia severity. And that's why we have a randomized clinical design where we make sure that those particular features are covered off in each of the groups and they're equal. We also need to make sure that the treatment, as we prescribed it, is delivered as we say it must be delivered. And I'll come back to that in the talk. What we also need to make sure is that we're able to measure the changes in the behaviour so that those changes are meaningful and they're sensitive to the amount of change that we see. And our last thing is that we want to see carryover. We want to say that this therapy that we did is better in the task that we practiced it in, but we also are better at, so for example, if we were going to practice picking up a cup or doing up our shoelaces is a good example, that we need to be able to see that we can improve on that task, but also that we can do up 15 shoelaces in the amount of time that we need to, or that we know how to do it with our eyes closed, or that we know how to tie somebody else's shoelaces. And that important navigation around being able to do the skill and then be able to make sure you can do it in different situations. And that's the same for communication. We want to make sure that people don't only understand a word list, but that they're able to communicate in their functional environment. So in the VERSE trial, we did, we have to have an assumption, a hypothesis that underpins our trial and our scientific question. So for VERSE, that scientific question was based on the fact that the neuroscience literature says that intense intervention improves outcome early in that spontaneous recovery period. So our question in VERSE was, if we provide intense aphasia therapy, will it result in an improved or greater Western aphasia outcome score, that's our outcome measurement, at 12 weeks after the stroke at our carryover point, and then when we compare that to our standard usual practice? Or, in other words, does early intensive direct aphasia therapy enhance spontaneous recovery more than standard usual care? And we have to have a measurement time point, and we made that at 12 weeks. So we also wanted to see in our study design that we may get carryover. So we measured again at 26 weeks after the stroke. And then we wanted to make sure that we had, because it's a very large trial, other hypotheses that sit around our intervention. Inverse, and I'll show you the design in the next couple of slides, we wanted to see if we provided a standard therapy at a high dose and a very prescribed therapy at a high dose, whether there would be a difference in those two groups at the high dose level. The third thing we wanted to do, or third and fourth thing, was to say if we provided language therapy and early intensive language therapy, would people have a better quality of life because they had a better result? And would they have less depression? And that's our carryover question, in particular to different aspects of how communication can affect people's lives. So our eligibility criteria, or the characteristics of the people in the study, are very similar to what we would have in a normal clinic that comes through in an everyday acute setting. That these people needed to have had a stroke, they needed to have an aphasia, they needed to be ready to start therapy within the first 2 weeks, because that therapy window, that spontaneous recovery window, is believed to be within the first 2 weeks. To be able to hook into that neural recovery and to enhance it, we had to start therapy within that time frame. These people needed to be able to be medically stable and be awake, to be able to interact, basically. And then we had a whole range of other exclusion criteria that meant if these people were included in the trial, it would make it very difficult for us to answer the question. So we had people with a chronic aphasia were not permitted into the trial because we wanted to make sure we were getting spontaneous recovery. People who had dementia or a depression, other people who may have had a neurological disease, and we needed to be able to do the therapy in English. So the trial had just a diagram here, people starting when the day of stroke. They needed, like I said, to be in and ready to go to start therapy on or before day 15. We then randomized the group, the people, to one of three groups. They either got standard usual care, they got standard usual care and we added extra therapy, or they got standard usual care and we added a prescribed intervention. They needed to do the intervention over a period of 4 weeks or 28 working days. And then we had what we call a period of washout or a rest period where people went back to standard service, whatever their service was across the country and in New Zealand. And then we measured how their communication was at 12 weeks and then again at 26 weeks. So the intervention, what was it? We had people in usual care, and we expected usual care based on our previous work, the 2 pilot studies we did, so my PhD, and another second trial we did where we monitored what intervention people were getting, to be less than 6 hours across that 4 weeks. Our second group was the usual care plus, where we got these people, we gave these people an extra 20 sessions, but of the same type of therapy as the standard usual care. So we said to those clinicians, do what you normally do with these, with the people with aphasia, do the normal tasks you would usually do, but we want you to do it for 20 sessions, and we want you to make sure those sessions are 45 to 60 minutes so that those people get an extra 15, a minimum of extra 15 hours of intervention over that time. Our third group got standard ward-based care therapy, but we provided these people with individually prescribed intervention, and I'll talk about what that is shortly. Predominantly, we made that intervention a conversation-based intervention. And we also wanted that intervention to be focused on not overusing or minimizing, is probably a better way of saying it, minimizing error productions. So basically scaffolding for communication success. So the prescribed therapy, we aimed to have it in a verbal output. We needed to make sure that it was high dose, so the number of productions in each of those 20 sessions. And we needed to make sure that it was done at a high intensity, meaning that it needed to be done daily across that 4-week period, 5 days a week. And how did we do it? We did it by engaging in a meaningful and authentic communication exchange that was predominantly around conversation, turn-taking, making sure the topics were relevant, and that above all, that the output the speech people were producing was scaffolded to be accurate. So verse therapy amalgamates a number of different therapeutic strategies or principles, I guess, and we targeted linguistic impairments so that it was an impairment-based intervention, but we also made sure that it had a social construct, like I said, and that it was addressing semantic, so word meaning, syntactic, the sentence structure, and the sound production in the phonological sense. And we made sure that our therapeutic approach to that was around a high relevance to communication theory. And by that, I mean, we made sure that our evidence that we used and based verse on was of the highest quality we could produce. So how did we get people started? So they came in the verse therapy, came into the trial, and we had a decision-making task. We made sure that depending on their scores of their outcome measure at the Western Aphasia Battery, depending on how much spoken language they had and what their comprehension was, they fell within a range of scores. We also had what's called a mean length of utterance. So how long is the utterance that someone can speak? And then we had the Boston naming test. And what we did was then classify people into a standard level of severity that correlated to the level of goals that we had prescribed for the verse intervention. And I'll run through a couple of those in the next couple of slides to give you an idea. So predominantly, this is the first goal in verse, and you'll see that it really is very much like, for those of you who are not familiar with what a therapy plan looks like, this is a very standard therapy plan that we would use to make sure that the therapist doing the therapy knows what it is that the goal of the therapy task is. And so in this goal, which is our comprehension goal, we needed to make sure that people had comprehension sufficient to have a vocabulary that they could interact and understand. And we based that on normal developing language literature around a knowledge base of 50 words. So what we did say to people and our therapists that we needed to be able to get the people working at this level to have an understanding of 50 nouns, verbs, or adverbs and adjectives. So any class of word, they needed to know and understand 50 words. If we found that the people were working at this level and they needed to move up quickly because they could display that they were able to get words out and had that vocabulary, we moved them straight into the next goal. If they were unable to do that, we made sure that the therapist worked to an 80% accuracy level of targets to be able to understand 80% of those words. If we move straight into the goal 5, which is a much more complex goal, just to give you an example of the verse intervention, what we did here is make sure that people were scaffolded to produce independent speech. What we were after was speech to be able to have some form of interaction. So we would maybe talk about tennis is the example here with the increase and decrease steps. Can you tell me anything about tennis? So quite often different tournaments on, people have an interest. It doesn't have to be tennis. It was a topic of any choice that meant something to the participant. And what we did then was scaffold and talk about our level of interaction with the person. If they had a difficulty trying to find a word, or their word wasn't wasn't an accurate word, that would mean that the person had produced an error. In verse, we had an approach where we only allowed 3 errors before the scaffold was given as a direct model to help the person achieve and produce the word. So what then we would do is say to the therapist, that's fine, you can cue at any level. And this is we've only got the first page here, a cueing hierarchy. So we would say to the therapist, cue with whatever cue you think the person is going to be successful with. But if they have an error and you cue, you're not allowed to cue with the same cue twice. What that meant was that the therapist then, it didn't work the first time, so go to the next cue. Go down the cueing hierarchy until the person who's with aphasia is able to find their successful cue. And what we found over our pilot work was that over the first 4 to 5 sessions generally, the people you were working with would end up with a set of probably 2 or 3 cues that were their most successful cues. What we then did in the therapy sessions is teach the therapist to teach the people with aphasia how to independently use that cueing system so that they started to self-cue. And that goes on for any type of error that's produced. So be it a sound system error, a word finding difficulty, or a sentence structural error, we would cue with the appropriate cue for that person and scaffold around successful production. So what do we do when we measured this? So because notoriously aphasia is difficult to measure, particularly so that we account for spontaneous recovery, but also because in many studies before ours, they had restricted their people coming into the study with a certain severity of aphasia. And it's really important to us that we took all comers with aphasia in this very early period, because we needed to make sure we knew what was going on. And so that meant we couldn't use a standard outcome. There, better? Oh, sorry, team. What we did then was make a percent of the amount of recovery that people were getting, so that we were able to measure and make sure we were accounting for severity in people's recovery. And so a percentage amount of score, if someone came in at a score of 50%, let's say, they only had 50% to go on a score of 0 to 100. And what we needed to be able to do is compare someone who came in at 0 and someone who came in at 80 on that same scale. So changing it to a percentage score meant that we could do that. We also needed to make sure that in our trial, one of the rules of a clinical trial is that you need to be making sure that everybody gets the intervention they're prescribed, so that at the end of the trial, you can compare the groups as they were at the beginning of the trial. So you don't want people to cross over into another group or get more therapy than they're supposed to or get less than they're supposed to. You need to make sure that they get the right amount, and that when we analyse that, they all stay in their same groups. We also recognise that people drop out of trials, all trials, and we saw that, but our trial had enough people in it that we expected to lose 20%. So what did we do? Between June 2014 and February 2018, we screened across the 17 acute sites in Australia and New Zealand, nearly 13,600 people with stroke. What we found was that 3,400 of those odd had aphasia, excuse me, and that we enrolled 246 of those people. So that gives us a rate of about 25% of people with post-stroke aphasia, which is a little lower than other studies have shown. And maybe that's something to do with the Australian and New Zealand cohort, we're not too sure. What we also saw was that we had 434 people transferred out of areas, so they were eligible for the trial, but we couldn't take them because they were from a rural or remote area. So that tells you how much our population transfers for medical health services. It was over double or nearly double what we had in the trial. This is really important as a slide because it shows you as a randomized process that the groups were even in number and that they received the intervention that they were supposed to receive. Overall, we needed to make sure that we had an 80% minimum value of those people getting what they were prescribed, and we reached that with an 83%. We also needed to make sure we followed those people up at 12 weeks, and we followed up 88% of those people, and that at 26 weeks, we followed up 82% of the people. So we made sure also that our baseline characteristics were equal, which is what I was talking about as a fundamental of the clinical trial, which is one of the reasons that you can believe very strongly these results. These 32% of the people were over 80 years old, and 91% of these people had a significant disability as a result of their stroke. So when we look at communication outcomes, the Western Aphasia Battery, like I said, is a severity rating score. And you'll see our groups are very evenly distributed. And the Western Aphasia Battery, when we look at it as a measure to be sensitive to change, we determine a 5-point difference in that score as a change that a lay person can recognise, which means that that becomes a clinically relevant and meaningful number on that score. And we'll see that 30% of our population, or 40% rather, a third of our population were severe in their aphasia score. So just looking at our therapy characteristics, this slide's got lots of numbers on it, but the bit I want you to have a look at, when you look across the table here, this is our standard care group, and these two groups, Usual Care Plus and Verse, are the two intensive groups. And what this tells us is when we combine these two groups together, that they're different, statistically different, in relation to the number of hours that they received, the number of therapy sessions they received, the sessions per week, the length of those sessions, and the total amount of therapy were all statistically different, meaning that we provided intense intervention to the people in those groups, and that was different to the usual care. And in our protocol, these were the most important factors relating to intensity. So number of sessions, sessions per week, and the length of the sessions, and the total amount in that intervention period. So how do we know we did this? So we had our therapists collate and write down, I'm sure a number of you collected hundreds literally of these sheets of paper that we then entered into our data system. We mapped our therapy across all these sites for every single time someone was seen in the trial. And we had over 10,000 episodes of speech pathology therapy across the 6 months for these people, which is extraordinary. We're still ploughing through that. We had an 83% compliance to our protocol, meaning that we prescribed that intervention and the people got it. We video recorded the people in our high intensity group, 1 therapy session a week for the 4 weeks, which equated to around about 372 hours of therapy. And we didn't, one of the therapy research assistants did, watched and judged every single one of those hours of therapy on this rating scale that matched up to our protocol to say, was the type of cueing correct? Was it done in the right time? Did the person achieve the targets for 80% of the session? If it was adherent for all of those characteristics, then the session was deemed adherent. So 83% of those videos were deemed to be adherent to the session. So our primary result showed us that at 12 weeks, the usual care group, when compared to the high intensity group, was less than 2 points different, meaning that the usual care group had a better outcome than the high intensity group, but that it was not statistically significant. And when we look at that as a raw score, people shifted, remember, from 41 or 40 and the baseline score that they came in at, to around 70 for usual care, 67 for a high intensity group, remembering that a 5-point change on the Western Aphasia Battery is a clinically meaningful difference. And so these people are getting upwards of 27 points on that scale, which is enormous. And when we see that, I'll show you in a graph, you'll see how much recovery what it is. We also, in our carryover outcomes, saw no difference at 12 weeks, meaning that usual care therapy or high intensity therapy was no better than standard care. Our talking results are the same. People were producing the same number of words, same accuracy of those words. And on a table, on a graph, it looks the same. You'll see that there's complete crossover here of the two groups, the pink being the usual care group and the blue being the high intensity group. And there really is very little difference. They started very closely aligned and they ended very closely aligned at 12 weeks and then again at 26 weeks. So that what we also see in this in this table is the recovery amount in this very early period. So it's a huge slope on that line, indicating the amount, that 27 points of recovery that you see, that I talked about, and that starts to peter out across that 12-week period after. It doesn't mean that it stops, and it certainly doesn't mean that people stop recovering. It just means that it slows down. So what does that look like in a real world? It looks like when someone describes our picture here, that the person says a dog, the wolf, a cat. And it took 1 minute and 4 seconds to get those 20 words out. This same person at 12 weeks said this. The dog's obviously had a bit of cake. The mother's trying to get him out with a broom. He's hidden underneath the couch. We've got 115 words there in 55 seconds, and 110 of those are accurate. So when we talk about what's meaningful, this type of language and verbal speech is really meaningful recovery. So when we talk about also what groups responded more than others, for those of you who are not familiar with a table like this, the midline means that one group on this side, the left side, is usual care, the right side is high intensity, and it doesn't make a whole lot of, it's not significantly different, meaning the groups are the same if it crosses over this middle line. And so what this shows us is that age, people over 80 have slightly favoured a less intense intervention. People in the middle age range between 65 and 80 slightly favoured high intensity intervention, but our young people in the trial did better with a lesser amount of intervention. And so it goes between male, female, high disability, low disability, and severity of aphasia. So usual care, what does it look like? It was 2.5 sessions a week over here on the left. The sessions were 35 minutes, a total of 9.5 hours across that 20 sessions. And at 12 weeks, we added another extra 3.5 hours, and another 3.5 hours at 26 weeks. And that's the amount of intervention that was provided to the people in the trial that did exactly the same as when we provided early intensive intervention. So I'm going to talk about spontaneous recovery a little bit as we go, and sometimes in the questions, so I put that slide up. But also, what does that mean clinically? It means that early language recovery is different from chronic language recovery, where we do lots of intensive intervention. It also means it's different to needing intensive motor recovery intervention. And so we know now that this early intensive intervention is feasible. We know that it's not harmful, but we also know that providing it in the first 40 days means that it's not better than standard care. It's not better than doing a more intensive intervention. More intensive intervention is not better than standard 9.5 hours of therapy. And so that's our therapy regimen that we believe integrated with spontaneous recovery to get an equal result to high intensity. And we think that that might be akin more to what we call a distributed practice, so that therapy was done over 2.5 sessions or 3 sessions a week for that period of time. It also begs the question around if we do this intensive intervention, is it really worth it financially? And there's a law in economics around and I always lose it as I go to say it, diminishing returns on investment, and starting to look at our health economics around, is this the case around early intensive intervention, that we're looking at a diminishing return the more intervention we do. So I'd like to stop there and ask for questions. Right, what do we do, Em?
Okay, so I think we're going to go to some questions.
Yeah, do you want that?
And I think...
okay, Emily, if you want to quit sharing, and I will do that now.
Thank you, Erin.
Oop, wrong one. Sorry.
Okay, so we have the first two questions at the top there about tolerating intervention. So a high intensity treatment may not be tolerable to all people with aphasia in the acute phase. How do we predict who will tolerate? And also the second question there is related. How do we tell if someone isn't tolerating intensive therapy?
Okay, I'm going to answer the first question to say, on the back of these VERSE results, and this is not a systematic review and we don't have that evidence yet, but again, high intensive intervention in that first 12 weeks isn't looking like it's worth the spend. So to be able to, want to do that high intensive intervention, you're going to have an evidence base that supports it. And currently that high intensive level isn't looking like it's valuable. That doesn't mean that the therapy shouldn't start early. They're two different questions, and there's very strong evidence to start early, but it means that as a person with aphasia and a clinician, you have a greater level of scientific evidence to show you that 2.5 to 3 sessions a week is adequate to give you an outcome that's equal to 5 to 6 sessions a week. So if you're asking about who tolerates high intensity therapy, I ask you why, because you probably don't need to be doing it that early. And when we say not tolerating it, people would refuse. So we would show that they didn't want to do it. They would stop therapy, fall asleep, a whole range of, or just basically say no, they didn't want to do anymore. Is that answered both of those?
Yes, I think so. We'll move on to the next one. Will VERSE be available to clinicians as a treatment protocol?
Yes, it is. We're rolling it out in a training package. We've done that with the sites that were participating sites in the trial, just as a thank you to say, here's the package. I also, when I do that training, so that we have training videos, the package, and a therapy fidelity package that we've put together so that you can make sure you're measuring what you need to be measuring to deliver the intervention, to make sure that people are understanding it's become another tool to do therapy. It isn't better than your standard usual care that clinicians are providing in clinics as part of these results. So I just caution or just make that really very aware that people are knowing that.
Okay, and then the next one, what treatment fidelity was in the trial? Do you know that the intervention protocol was adhered to? I think that popped up before you went to the treatment fidelity part of your talk. So we might go to the next one. In your efforts to publish the trial, what reasons have the referees suggested for the neutral result? And is the trial in press yet? From Richard L. You might know who that is.
Thank you, Richard. So in our efforts, the reasons for a null result, so there are two of these that have been levelled adverse, and I think quite reasonably so. One comes from the neuroscience literature where the neuroscientists, so the motor recovery stroke rehabilitation scientists who work with humans, have categorically said the intensity that we provided the intervention was insufficient. And I come back to those reviewers and come back to the people who are doing that science with 2 points to say, there's nothing in these data whatsoever that look like there's a trend to shift any of our data points whatsoever. We don't have any kind of indicator that looks like early intensive interventions better than standard 9.5 hours. The other point that I come back to is, as a clinician, I'm not confident we could have pushed the people in the trial to do any more intense intervention, because we pushed quite hard, and I think people wouldn't necessarily tolerate a whole lot more. We would be needing to do weekend sessions, and I do challenge how we might be maybe thinking about our theory in a different way. And the trial, I'm about to resubmit for the 4th time this weekend, Richard, so fingers crossed it gets through.
Okay, a few questions about usual care. Is usual care direct therapy? Does this include our communication partner training and education? And maybe also the next one as well, was the dose of usual care higher than you expected?
So the analysis that I showed in this presentation was only aphasia therapy, direct therapy. So we collected those 10,000 occasions of service. We collected the only part of the intervention that was in this analysis was direct language therapy. We recognise the value of all of the other services that are put into a speech pathology practice or an aphasia recovery treatment therapy regimen, and we have that information, and we're doing lots of sub-studies to answer some more of those questions. But if people provided usual care that was communication partner training or whatever usual care was, we have a record of what it was and they did it. So we weren't allowed to prescribe what usual care therapy was. We just said, go ahead and do it. And yes, we expected usual care therapy to be much lower than we saw. So had it been lower than we saw, we may have had a statistical response, a statistical difference, but in line, and this is one of those things in a clinical trial, it's a chance you take when you compare it to an intervention that's standard practice. You assume when you start that standard practice stays the same, and it's very likely that that increased across time. So it's one of our things with the trial.
Okay, So that was both of those usual care ones. Is there going to be further research about when and how much therapy we should be providing to people in the chronic stage of aphasia recovery?
Yes, and not from VERSE research particularly, obviously, because we didn't do chronic, but there's some beautiful information coming through from an international collaboration from the aphasia trialists across the world in the release data. That was a huge, I think we ended up with about 6,000 participant data points, which is huge, and that it's very strongly associated with starting therapy early, which was fantastic, or within the first month, but also how much therapy people got. And those publications are due out in 2020. So that information's coming. But of course, the CRE is also doing some really beautiful work on how much, what dose, when to do it, what type of intervention. So across the next 5 years, I'm hoping, well, we're all hoping, and we all will be generating some beautiful research evidence to be able to help you guide practice.
Okay. Did you measure changes in the use of self-cueing strategies during therapy, and if so, how?
No, we didn't. If we can go back and have a look at the therapy videos, if you're looking for a PhD, we've got so much data. Please do come and contact us, because we're analysing at the moment, gosh, we've had a detailed analysis of 54 videos. All of the videos are being looked at a gross level, but if you're interested in looking at the question, we've got the data. So we're really keen to be working with people who have got clinical questions, but no, we didn't measure it.
Okay, and the last question that we're going to go to, when you say intensive therapy is feasible, what feasibility characteristics are you describing?
So what we called feasible in the trial was the 45 to 60 minutes, 5 days a week, and that it was done across the 4 weeks of the trial. So being feasible means that we were able to do that level of intervention, and that feasibility means that the people were doing it, tolerated it essentially. And with language therapy, that means that they didn't refuse essentially. Hope that answers that one.
Okay, thank you, Erin. And I'm just going to end on this comment here. It looks like what clinicians are currently doing works. It's great to have such rigorous evidence to support our exciting services. Thanks, Erin.
Yeah, it does work. So please keep doing it. It's really important. And thanks very much for listening. It's been great.
Okay. So thank you for your participation today. I'll just get up the final slide. And we welcome you back in January. So there's a break in December. We look forward to hosting the next one Wednesday, 29th of January. It won't be in Western Australia, but back over east. We are excited to have Professor David Copland from the University of Queensland talk to us about neurobiological and psychosocial predictors of recovery. And we thank you, Erin.
Thank you.